up?
No, it's good to go. Proceed.
Oh, thank you all. I don't know who did it, but thank you, whoever did that. Okay. We're gonna, you can enter questions into the chat box. Karen will also interrupt if there's a question that's really pertinent to that moment, and we'll go with that. At any rate, we're going to talk tonight about bird migration here on the northern Gulf Coast. And I will say that a couple of the photographers who gave me permission to use their photographs are with us tonight, and I appreciate that so much. We will be talking mostly about passerine or songbird migration. Even though I have a picture of shorebirds up here, we'll be talking about passerine migration. And the presentation is applicable for the area really from Grand Isle, Louisiana to southeastern, in southeastern Louisiana, all the way over to the Apalachicola River area. And like I said, we're going to be talking mostly about songbirds. They're going to be some questions that we hope that we'll be able to answer, at least in part. Why do birds migrate? When do they start moving north in the spring? What routes do these migrants follow? What are the mechanics of migration? What spring weather produces a fallout? And where can I find weather maps to show me? Or where can you find weather maps to show you? So before we get into all of those questions, I have to share that the ideas of bird migration are not ideas that went all the way back to the beginning of intelligent life. Way back when there were those who actually thought that birds did not migrate at all. In fact, it was Aristotle who thought that swallows hibernated. And they didn't know where they hibernated, but that's what they thought at the time. And then along came, in the 17th century, along came Charles Morton. And before Charles Morton, even 400 years before Christ, as they were wondering where birds would go in the wintertime, Aristotle pontificated and said, yes, they even bury themselves, sometimes even in the water, but they hibernated. And then along came, in the 16th century, along came Olaus Magnus, who said that swallows disappeared in the winter because they buried themselves in the clay in the bottom of the rivers. And he said then they come together in huge swarms in the fall, and they bury themselves in mass. So if you're looking for swallows, here's some options for you. But then along came in the 17th century, Charles Morton, who said that he thought that they went to the moon. And that was an idea that hung around for quite a while. There were all kinds of theories, and this one was, of course, one of the most bizarre. He even wrote about it quite eloquently, and even wrote about how far it was he thought to the moon, and how long it would take him to get there, and how long it would take him to get back, and that they would do that every year. And along about that time, there were sailors who were out in the ocean, and they had a woodcock come down and land on the deck. Well, of course, where did the woodcock come from? But no place other than the moon. So there was a lot of interesting speculation about where the heck these things came from. And then later on in the 17th century, a man named Francis Willoughby set us down the path to reasonable ideas about migration. And he wrote in, his publication was Ornithologia. It was a masterwork of bird science for the time. And he's even been equated with John James Audubon and his Birds of America. But he refuted Aristotle's notion of swallows hibernating and other birds hibernating. And he was also not under the impression that they went to the moon, but more modestly, he said, no, they all go to the north end of Africa. Well, Africa worked into the whole idea here when in 1822, a white stork was found in Germany with an arrow in it. The arrow was made from a Central African hardwood, which provided some of the earliest evidence of long distance stork migration. So it wasn't too much of a jump that if storks migrate long distances from Central Africa to Germany, that possibly other birds might do that. So we want to think in terms about why migrate. In the fall, birds, well, in both spring and fall, birds are going to move from areas of low or decreasing resources, and they're going to move into areas of high or increasing resources. Now, in the fall, obviously, with weather chilling and resources such as insects and food decreasing, they're going to move south. So in the spring, they have, they're in the tropics, they're far south. They still have a good bit of food there, but they have a density of other birds providing competition for nesting sites and such. So they start moving north, and they're seeking food and nesting locations. And they move north at a time, coordinated with the explosion of insect populations and budding plants and abundant nesting locations. And another thing that for those of you who have ever been in the tropics, as I know some of you have, you've got 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night. But if you move north into the temperate regions, your days are longer, and longer days mean you can hunt for food for longer periods of time. You can have several broods rather than just one. And in North America, the average number of fledglings will be something like 4 to 6, whereas in South America, in the tropical areas, it's 2 to 4. And so less crowding in North America for nesting sites, less competition, and therefore they don't have as much of a waste of energy. And so then we might start thinking about, when should we see the first migrants? Is it January, February, March, or April? Well, those of you who've been out with your binoculars now, you already know that here we are in March. We've got birds here in March, even though they're trickling through. What about February? Did we have any in February? What about January? Well, let's look at that a little bit more closely. We know, of course, that in January, in late January, we start seeing the scouts of purple martins. This is a male. He looks pretty weather beaten, and I expect that he probably feels that way, having just flown anywhere between 600, 650 miles. If he started at Yucatan or in Central America, if he started farther south, he's got a few more miles on him. The males, of course, arrive first, and they scout out areas that they want to nest and so forth. So in January, we can look for our first migrants. In February, we look for the northern parulas.
It used to be that we would see these, we had the earliest date ever, February 20th, which was Lucy's birthday. So that was easy to remember. But somebody beat us to it in 2018 and found one,
February 18th.
February 18th, and found one much earlier.
It's a shame that he could remember my birthday because it was the earliest date of a parula warbler arriving here. But anyway, so we look for parulas in February, and we didn't have them in February. There were 1 or 2 noted along the northern Gulf Coast, but right here we didn't get them. In March, I'm sure you've all started to see the hummingbirds coming in. And of course, part of the beauty of migration is how the different parts of the environment just coordinate. And these hummingbirds seem to arrive about the time that plants are beginning to bloom. We've got a Cherokee plum in bloom all over the place, and we've got lyre leaf sage in bloom on the roadsides, except for where they've churned up the roadsides here in Gulf Breeze. But at any rate, they arrive about the time the plants are coming out with blossoms. Of course, some people don't realize that hummingbirds enjoy the nectar and the sugar or the sugar water from our feeders, of course, but they are major insect eaters. And when our oak trees are in catkins, if you see a hummingbird in the top of the oaks, watch it for a few minutes and you'll see it darting up and out just like a flycatcher catching gnats and other small critters. So we look for them in March. Also in March, we look for the water thrushes that breed here in the southern tier of the United States. The Louisiana water thrush.
Louisiana water thrushes come in early. Many of them are West Indian migrants, so they can afford to travel from the West Indies up the Florida Peninsula. And the northern water thrush, which we'll see shortly, comes in much later because it breeds much farther north.
Okay. Also in March, we see prothonotary warblers, and 2 of them showed up in our yard yesterday, and right on time. And of course, there's no doubting that spring is on the way when this little beam of sunlight comes in, and it just electrifies the yard when these little birds are around. But, looking at this photograph, I couldn't help but notice the beak. Look at the size of that honker. No wonder he's successful at catching bugs and so forth. Incidentally, prothonotary warblers are cavity nesters, and over in the Mobile River Delta area and over in southern Mississippi, they actually put out birdhouses for prothonotary warblers.
One year we were down on Yucatan Peninsula in March, and we could see the prothonotary warbler staging in the dense mangroves that grow along the Yucatan coast.
And there were a lot of them too, as I
A lot of
recall.
them.
Yeah. Also in March, we have prairie warblers, and this is another bird that comes up through the Antilles and works its way on up, island hopping, and then comes on up the peninsula, the Florida Peninsula, and comes on up here. And these birds breed down here where we are, not immediately on the coast, but inland, wherever they find things that are cut over, maybe pine trees that are about, if you find planted pines that are about 10 to 15 years old, they really like those. They like some thick scrub sometimes, but not in mature high deciduous forests, but in more cut over areas is where we would find the prairie warblers. Okay. In late March, we start getting black and white warblers. I think some of you all have already had black and white warblers. We've had 1 or 2. And of course, one of the beautiful things about a black and white warbler, especially for novice birders, is that it's named perfectly. And it's one of the few birds that a novice birder, as I remember many moons ago, that I could remember the name of. And here's the northern water thrush.
There's a northern water thrush. If you notice, the eye line on that bird is much thinner and darker than it was on the Louisiana water thrush we saw earlier. Also note the throat on the northern water thrush, it's streaked, whereas on the Louisiana, it was unstreaked. So those are 2 good field marks that separate the 2 species.
I think my favorite field mark for the 2 water thrushes in the springtime is the color of the legs of the Louisiana water thrush. They are bubblegum pink. Okay. Now these birds getting up here are in a rush by the end of, by April. It's the height of migration in early April. And they're in a rush to establish some nest sites. And so that's when you start seeing more and more coming through, such as the two rose-breasted grosbeaks here, the male and the female. And I have to comment this. One year, it was one of the very first trips Bob and I ever made to Ecuador, and we were with Ann and Dan Forrester. And we were on a mountain road that dropped off into a canopy of trees. And suddenly, Ann and I saw this gorgeous black and white bird and a bit of a flash of red. And we knew that it was some tropical species we'd never seen before. It landed in a tree and we got a good look and a good laugh. It was a male rose-breasted grosbeak. So at any rate, we've gotten on up here through the beginning of April and mid-April. And then here in April, they all start coming through. We've got the male and female summit tanagers coming through, and the male comes in, and the minute he lands, he starts calling. I think he's looking for others to say, okay, we made it. The scarlet tanagers are coming in as well as many more.
So why the last 2 weeks in April? For the last 2 weeks in April, cold fronts are becoming scarce in this area. The birds have less chance of getting clobbered in the Gulf by headwinds and rain and such. So that's why they can really start moving north without fear. But that is not always the case. But we'll get into that shortly on weather and birds.
Yeah. And another reason some of the birds come in later is like these scarlet tanagers. They spend their winter down, of course, in Western South America, down as far as Bolivia. So they have a longer way to go. I expect that they start their travels north and have a longer trip with a lot of stops on the way. So there's a flood of them that come on in through April. And by mid-April to the last of April, we've just got dozens of songbirds that are coming through. And any of these birds that you see here on this screen can be found here in Northwest Florida in the springtime and in migration. And that's one of the beauties of living near the coast here.
So if you got to plan a vacation for birding on the northern Gulf Coast, you'll want to take it in the last 2 weeks of April if you can.
Yeah. But we do have some birds that are laggards and that really come in late. Among those are bobolinks. The bobolink winters in central South America. It winters as far south as Argentina, northeastern Argentina. So he's got a very long way to go. They also don't nest down here in the southern tier of the United States. Then on the far right, you see a yellow-billed cuckoo. Those birds do nest here, but they are late in coming in. They winter in South America. They nest in our area, but they winter way south in South America. The black-billed cuckoo, which you see in the center bottom, they nest much farther north than the yellow-billed cuckoo does. They also don't go as far south during their wintering months. They winter in northern South America, but they have to go much farther north for their breeding.
I might add that black-billed cuckoos are really hard to find in migration. And I had one friend at Dauphin Island, is an excellent birder, and he was birding for 15 to 20 years before he saw his first black-billed cuckoo. So if you see one, count your blessings.
Yeah.
Oh, we have a question referring to the previous screen. What is the middle one with the blue head / cap? It looks beautiful.
I think you're looking at a painted bunting with the blue head, a red eye ring, a thick bill for crunching seeds, a red belly, and green and orange on the back. Painted buntings do breed in the South. There are breeding records in the Apalachicola area and in southern Georgia. And they do come in. They will come into your feeders. They particularly like white millet. They are a real treat to see. It took me years to see one as well. I think I saw my first one in spring of '73, and I had been birding 4 or 5 years at that point.
You have that to look forward to, Karen.
Yes. Okay. All right. So we're going to move on here from the birds that are coming in here.
I might add that as far as May migrants are concerned, well, we'll get into this later. I was going to talk about fallout and
We'll get
May. Yeah. Okay.
We'll
go
get
ahead,
that
go
later.
ahead.
Okay. So we might be wondering, where do these birds spend their time away? Here you see, here's where we are on the northern Gulf Coast, right up here. These birds spend the winter here in the Antilles, some of them in the Greater Antilles, the Lesser Antilles, in northern South America, and even farther in South America. Many of these migrants that we enjoy so much spend the winter here through Mexico and Central America. And it's interesting, the northern tip of the Yucatan Peninsula, before we ever went there, Bob and I both thought it would be lush, tropical rainforest type, but it really isn't. It's fairly dry for a good bit of the year. And the mangroves along there are very thick along the coastlines, at least prior to some of the last storms. And so it's fairly dry. So when birds are congregating here in Yucatan, getting ready to take off and fly 600 to 650 miles across the Gulf of Mexico, they may not be taking off from the very tip here. They may be taking off from central Yucatan. Yeah.
Yeah, we might add that if you go about 30 miles south of the northern coast, it starts to become very lush. And also a Mexican birder down there told us that he sees a lot of migrants staging in the mangroves. Now we're not talking about mangroves like you see in South Florida. We're talking about big mangroves, like a huge forest of mangroves.
Very tall, 20, 30 feet tall along the edges of some of the wilder areas, quite a few. And same thing in South America. You've got extremely tall ones off of Guayaquil, Ecuador, and all along there. They're taller than our cherry laurel trees. They're huge. So at any rate, this is where these birds will be spending their winter time. And of course, as the red arrow indicates over here, you know, many of them go way south into the Amazon Valley, and then on down into Argentina, Bolivia, and a few into the lowlands on the east side of Chile. There. So what are some of the routes that these birds take? The three main routes that bring birds to the northern Gulf Coast in the spring. The routes are determined, what route the birds take is determined by where they actually wintered. And then they're strongly influenced by weather and especially by wind direction. So we want to see something about what are these routes here, okay? A little bit of a problem here. What route do they take? In 1945, there was a major issue, a big dust up between some of the major ornithologists in who had a lot to say about birds and ornithology. They had a major disagreement, and they doggone near came to verbal blows over this whole thing. And just a minute. Okay, so at any rate, what happened is that, okay, let me get over here to where we are. In 1904, Wells Woodbridge Cook, who was an American ornithologist, he is considered the father of cooperative study of bird migration in, excuse me, in America. He first hypothesized that migrants flew over the Gulf of Mexico, and this was generally accepted. However, in 1945, so, you're looking at, roughly 40 years later, George Williams, who was Dr. George Williams, who was at Rice University in Texas, he published an article in the Auk. Now, the Auk is the publication of the American Ornithologists Union, now known as the American Ornithologists Society. It is one of the major publications for ornithology in the United States. And he published this article in the Auk, and he challenged Cook and his theories. And he said absolutely that birds definitely did not, could not, and would not fly across the Gulf of Mexico. Well, I have to diverge just briefly here, because after Cook and Williams had their little dust up, and it wasn't really settled at that time at all. It was an ongoing discussion, shall we say. Along came Francis Marion Weston. And of course, he is the eponymous founder of our organization, the Francis M. Weston Society of, not Society of Natural History. That's what he founded. It's now Audubon Society. And Mr. Weston moved to Pensacola in 1916. And his job was at the Naval Air Station. And he had connections with some of the ornithologists up in the Northeast. And they said to him, that area has never been thoroughly studied. This would be a wonderful thing for you to do. And he did. And as he began to study the birds here in Northwest Florida, he decided to do something else. And he became a mentor to a number of Boy Scouts as they were working on their bird study badge. And it was those men and Mr. Weston and the women who birded with them who founded the Francis F.M. Weston Society of Natural History. But one of his Boy Scouts was George Lowry. And tell us something about George Lowry, Bob.
George Lowry wrote the Birds of Louisiana, which was published in 1974. And he was a prominent ornithologist on along the Gulf Coast of Louisiana. And he did exhaustive studies, studying the birds down at watching them come into Grand Isle, Louisiana. He'd have his graduate students lie out on the sand with telescopes, looking up at the moon. And of course, that's what graduates.
Hey, can you imagine
That's what
graduate students being required to go to the beach and
Well,
lie on the beach?
and lie on the beach, yeah, and look at the moon at night and watch the migrants pass through. But he knew that there was transgulf migration was a given for him. There was no question about him. He took a boat in 1945 across the Gulf, a ship to the Yucatan Peninsula, to observe the birds that would land on the boat. And he was absolutely certain of this. So he just said, George William doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
We
So
have a
anyway,
question.
yeah,
I'm sorry, Lucy. Did you say 1916 or 1960?
16. 16.
Thank you.
1916. Yes. Okay. At any rate, Let me see where we were there. Okay. Yeah, I got it. Well, anyway, so Lowry had his graduate students out there, and one of his graduate students was Sidney Gothrow. Now, Sid Gothrow was a professor of ornithology at Clemson for many years, and I think he's retired. I think he's professor emeritus
It's at
now
Clemson now.
at Clemson.
He's in Clemson. I might point out that his name is pronounced Gautreaux because he's from Louisiana and the H is silent in French, for what
Okay.
it's worth.
Okay, so Sid Gautreaux took up the banner, and he was one of Lowry's students, and he proved the same thing, but he used a completely new and different method to do so. He used NexRad radar, and NexRad, I think, stands for Next Generation Radar, and it's just called NexRad radar. And when you look at the weather map, when you look at your weather program on television and they show you a front moving across, that's all generated by the NexRad radar. And so he used the radar studies to definitely establish bird migration because the radars have become so sensitive, they can pick up birds and insects.
He did the seminal work on radar studies and bird migration.
Okay. So, all right. So we've got three routes we've talked about birds as they come up here. Leaving Yucatan, they do not aim for any.
We might back up just a minute here because as it turns out, both Lowry and
Wells,
the Rice professor, what was his name again? Williams, yeah, they were both correct.
Oh yeah, that's nice. At any rate, birds leaving Yucatan are going to be flying north across the Gulf. Many of them end up in the Galveston area. We hope that they'll end up in the Pensacola, Northwest Florida area, and some of them even in Cameron Parish, Louisiana, where they end up over there. Galveston is at about 95 degrees west longitude, and most birds will end up basically in that particular area. But we can consider those flying across the Gulf as that is one route. The birds fly across the Gulf, and they may end up in Galveston. They may end up in Corpus Christi or in Pensacola, or maybe even over in Fort Myers or St. Petersburg, depending on what?
Wind direction and velocity.
The wind direction and velocity. Other birds fly island hopping, as we said, and then they come on up through Florida. They come on up the peninsula of Florida. They either come to the interior of the United States. Others will travel on up the East Coast. And then we've got those that come on up through Mexico and up through Texas. And some of those birds are cheaters. They get to right about Brownsville, Texas, and they cheat. They don't go all the way on around. They just say, okay, and they'll take off and fly across the northwest corner of the Gulf. That has been established a number of different times that these birds will do that. They'll hop that way.
We're not talking about fall migration now, but Gautreaux's radar studies showed that in the fall, and we're not going to cover fall migration, but I'll point this out. In the fall, when we get a norther and the wind is north and northeast, the birds come down from the north, from the Appalachians, to get to the northern Gulf Coast around Pensacola, Biloxi, Mobile, and then they cut west-southwest. They don't go straight across. They will go straight across if they have a due north wind. But normally, when they don't have strong winds, they will cut across to the west-southwest. But I digress. I digressed.
Digression is okay. Okay.
Fall migration, okay.
Okay. So we wonder then what controls whether the birds take off and head north. Okay. First of all, it's the length of the day. The day length triggers hormonal changes within these birds. The hormones create a restlessness within these birds. And then, of course, there's the ultimate trigger, the weather. When they're ready to go, they want good weather to take off to make a long journey. They're not going to take off in the face of a wind. When the wind's opposing them, they're not going to take off. So the weather is the major trigger that says, they say, okay, we're ready to go. Let's get out of here. The weather's good. We've got a tailwind and let's do it. So we want to know, okay, when do they take off? When do they take off and how do they fly? Bob, can you address that?
When did they take off? They take off both in fall and spring, about a half hour after sunset. And they fly anywhere from 500 meters to 3,000 meters, depending on the species, depending on the time of day, whether it's night or day. They fly higher over land in daytime and lower at night. Why is this?
Well, at night, they don't have the rising air to give them lift, for one thing. And they fly higher in the daytime, hopefully to avoid predators like peregrine falcons that love to pick them off. Another thing too, they take off individually, even though they may have been aggregating in certain places. They take off individually and then they coalesce into groups that are basically single species groups or closely related species.
And it's not known how they do this.
Actually, there's more that is not known about migration than there is that is known from what I can tell. So I wonder, how fast do they fly?
In still air, about 30 miles an hour. But with tailwinds or headwinds, that's going to vary, and we'll get into that in a little while.
Yeah. Another thing, when these birds arrive here on the northern Gulf Coast, a lot of us birders like to call it the Yucatan Express when they arrive. And they'll arrive anywhere, usually between 9 and 10 in the morning on up to very early afternoon, depending, as Bob has said several times, depending on the wind and the weather.
Generally, we plan on birding around 11:30 if we're going to go out to a migrant trap and look for birds. 11:30, they start arriving, and that'll go on through about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But that could vary. That depends on the wind direction and velocity. But normally that's what we do. But in fall, of course, it's just the opposite. You want a bird in the early morning.
I cannot think of any birding day that we've ever started out at 10:30 or 11. But anyway,
Lunch call.
we could have slept late. Okay. So what really controls in spring the birds, the weather, and so forth? Have you heard of the Bermuda High?
All right. It's a high pressure cell that with clockwise winds, which is centered roughly near Bermuda, but varies. It varies, may move slightly west, may move to the east, but it produces southeast winds generally along our coast. And that's not good for us, for birds at least.
Yeah. And as the slide says, from a bird's viewpoint, they go with the flow. That's what they have to do. Now here's a hand-drawn weather map here, and you see a high-pressure system sitting here off of the Carolina coast.
This was taken from our first edition of the birds of Escambia, Santa Rosa, and Okaloosa counties.
Okay. So here you've got a high-pressure system. And the lines that you see, these are called isobars. And isobars are areas of identical or nearly identical barometric pressure. So everything along each of these individual lines will have roughly the same barometric pressure. And you know that wind is going to flow from a high pressure area to a lower pressure area. And on a high pressure system, the winds are going to flow in a clockwise direction.
And if you look at the arrows coming out of Yucatan, those two arrows, they're headed right for the Galveston area.
Yep, headed over here for Galveston and Cameron Parish, Louisiana. And David is online. He's with us, David Sparks, who's an absolutely incredible photographer and contributed some of these photographs. David has spent a huge amount of time at Bolivar Flats in the upper Texas coast and down in Cameron Parish, and documenting with beautiful photographs birds there. If you've never been down there in spring or fall migration, that's something that you've got to do. Okay, so I'm going to move on here. Okay. Gautreaux says that the peak densities of most trans-Gulf migrants arrived on the northern Gulf Coast around 95 degrees west longitude or near Galveston Bay. And but birds don't always end up around 95 degrees. So they're going to head north with the least resistance. I was going to say that if they have tailwinds that push them a little bit west, they're going to go a little bit west.
We're good into that. I might point out that we were at an Alabama Ornithological Society meeting years ago. And Gautreaux, Dr. Gautreaux was the speaker. And he said that he did not think a bird took off from Yucatan with a particular destination in mind along the northern Gulf Coast. So it's going to be fluid. It's going to depend upon where the winds are and how strong they are.
Okay. But in the last 2 weeks of April, of course, the birds really want to take off. And there's a problem here. If you look at the weather systems here over the Gulf, over the Antilles, Central America, and Northern South America, those birds might not be willing to take off. They have nasty weather. We've seen a lot worse weather. The later in the season, the more heat is going to be generated in the Gulf and in the Caribbean Sea, and the chances of terrible storms and so forth. These birds, say a bird sitting around here in Central America, isn't going to be taking off from interior to try to fight nasty weather going off. So it's important for us who want to go birding to check satellite images, look for unsettled weather in the Southern Gulf and the Yucatan.
And wind direction and velocity. And
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, lots of times we've said, oh, the conditions are perfect. Birds are going to be coming in. But that was before we learned that we had to look and see what were the weather conditions where the birds would be leaving.
Before the computer age, we didn't have this information. And I remember we had typical fallout conditions at Dauphin Island one spring day, and I was out with my birding friends, veteran birders who've been around a long time, and we were expecting this fallout around 11:30, 12 o'clock in the day, and nothing happened all day. We were trying to figure out what is the problem. Well, as it turns out, we didn't know what was going on down in Yucatan. And we've since learned, since the computer age, we have all this information where you can look at the satellite photographs and find out, hey, it's raining down in Yucatan, or there's north wind, and they're not going to take off. So live and learn.
But by the end of April, if these birds have not taken off to fly north, they're getting panicky because they know that they've got to move it. And a lot of them will go ahead and risk it. But after the end of April, migration for spring basically ends here on the northern Gulf Coast. It does extend into May. I'm trying to think, Bob, when was the latest
Fallout in May.
fallout in May? It was around
In my
12th?
records, I have May 12th as the
12th.
latest fallout. And of course, it can be a fallout, but you're limited in the number of species you're going to get because most of the species are coming in late April. In May, you're still going to get birds on the fallout, but there won't be as many species.
So the point here is that you want to check, see what the weather stations are saying in Merida, in Cancun, and in Havana, and see what's going on down there if you're looking for birds that are going to be crossing the Gulf of Mexico, okay?
Now, this program we put together some years ago, and I had to rely on weather stations in Merida, Cancun, and Havana, but now we have a new source of information, and we'll get into that.
Okay, so here is a fantastic source. This is windy.com. And I'm going to try to show you windy.com. So I'm going to share another screen. I think I can do it. Okay. I can't do it.
Ah.
Wait a minute. I've lost myself here. Okay, scratch that. I have to exit this to do that. But anyway, I'll show you what you can get on Windy right here. Okay, hold on. There we go. This is a screenshot that I took about an hour and a half ago on Windy. You can see all these little white lines. These are arrows that are indicating the wind speed. If you look right about up here, this is where you've got a high pressure system. You can see these arrows are spinning in a clockwise direction here. Okay, over here, you've got another high pressure system off of the Texas coast, spinning in that direction. And if you're a bird on Yucatan right now, what's happening? You've got that wind coming right in your face.
You're
You're
not
not
going
going
to
to
take
take
off.
off.
I might point out this is surface winds. Now, I would go to about 3,000 feet to find, that's about the altitude that birds are flying, and find out what are the winds at 3,000 feet, which could be different from the surface winds sometimes. But in this case, this is tonight. And you can see the birds will not be taking off from Yucatan. They've got headwinds. They might be moving up the West Indies from Cuba up the peninsula of Florida. But look at the Northwest Gulf. You see west wind, we're getting strong west winds right now. I looked out at the bay about an hour ago, and it's really around 25 miles an hour out of the west. And so that could bring us Western species if this were later in the season, but it isn't. It's very early. But guess what? The Callaway's got a beautiful lark sparrow at Fort Pickens today, and that is a bird that migrates with the Western Gulf. So you can see those winds may have been influential in bringing that bird to Fort Pickens.
I'd like to call to your attention something here about Windy down in the lower right-hand corner of this picture there of Windy. It tells you what the winds are, and you can move that little orange box up and down to get different altitudes. And so you can see what the wind is like on the surface, which we have right here. No, I think these were at about 2,500 feet. You can also see
it says surface.
Okay, surface winds there. But Windy is certainly worth playing around with for a good while. You can learn an awful lot about our weather right here. You can enlarge it. You can focus in on Pensacola or Bay County. You can focus in on Colorado and San Diego as well. You can look at your weather radar, your satellite images, look all of these things over here in the right-hand side in that column over there. Is just really a fascinating site to investigate. But it's a fabulous site for finding what's going on locally for the birds, and then not so local down here when you're hoping these birds are going to be coming in. Okay, so and you can set your thing on Windy to show, specific areas and focus in on specific areas. This map I put on here about an hour to an hour and a half ago. The other item I wanted to show you is that Cornell University has what they call Birdcast. This is a photograph of bird migration forecast for tonight. You can see over here we've got March 24th. They're expecting 25 million birds to be coming in. You can see them coming in through Texas. We have a little bit of highlight here in southern Alabama and northwest Florida. That would suggest that we have birds coming in.
Not coming in so much as taking off.
Yeah,
They're already here because nothing's coming in. But unfortunately, this system does not take in the Gulf of Mexico. And we talked to the people who designed this and are operating it, and they gave me some technical explanation as to why they can't cover the Gulf of Mexico, which would be a great boon for us.
but they also told us they're working on it. So who knows, in the next year or so, we might be able to see some radar images from out over the Gulf that they don't have right now. But this predicts a nocturnal migration 3 hours after local sunset. It's updated every 6 hours, as this says. I'll show you that link in our very last slide.
I might add, this is very valuable in fall because then you can see the continent, what's coming down.
Okay.
We have a question.
Sure.
Is this a low number compared to peak migration times?
Is this a low number, the 25 million compared to
Oh,
peak migration?
I would say it's probably normal.
But compared to peak migration,
Well,
Was the question.
This is low compared to peak migration.
so there's the answer there. I will
Thank you.
say though, Bob and I have each been birding well over 50 years, which is amazing since we're only in our 30s. But at any rate, we have seen terrible attrition in the numbers of birds coming over. There were times in spring that we would walk down a road, say, to Dolphin Island and just have hundreds of birds flying up out of the grass and out of the bushes year after year. And it's been less and less every year. But that's one of the reasons we need to be even more careful to take care of what we've got.
Looking at this map, I may say that this is not infallible. It's useful. And I have a friend in Alabama who's Mr. Alabama Birds, and he and I both agree that what's being shown is not necessarily what's going to happen, but generally it's correct.
Okay.
We
Now-
have one more, I'm sorry, we
Oh.
have one more question, Lucy.
Sure.
Which birds are migrating here now?
Well, we talked about that earlier. We have prothonotary warblers that are coming in, black and white warblers. Parula warblers are in, they're already singing. Summer tanagers are arriving. They're kind of trickling in right now. And the swallows are beginning to show up. The barn swallows showed up a couple of weeks ago in very low numbers. Some bank swallows have been seen, and
Barn swallows,
barn and
and
what else?
purple martins.
Purple martins, of course, are in.
If you look at migration as a bell curve, we're just beginning to move up the bell.
Yeah. So did that answer the question, I hope? Okay, we'll move on.
Thank you.
Okay. Many of us are acclimated to seeing weather maps that look like this. And you can still get weather maps from NOAA and Weather Channel and so forth, and they may look like this.
This is the map I used to use before the advent of windy, which Lucy just explained. And this is what I had to use. And these are the symbols that show wind direction and velocity at various stations. If you go to Birmingham, you'll see the wind there, the arrow is pointing to the northwest. The wind there is at that particular time was southeast, and the arrow, each of the long bars is 10 miles an hour and the small one is 5. So the wind was 25 miles an hour out of the southeast of Birmingham.
35.
And I had to use these type of maps prior to the advent of windy and other news sources of information and trying to determine bird migration.
You can also see that the wind here in Yucatan was, at the time this map was made, was coming out of the southeast, was moving northwest. But that's puzzling. That was puzzling for a long time until Bob told me, he says, the prevailing winds here at that latitude are going to be out of the east. So at any rate, what happens with a high pressure system over here and the winds are moving in this direction, these birds are going to take off. They've got that west wind, but when they get, the east wind, and then they get away from land and they're going to get into the channel of the high pressure system, and it's going to bring them right up to Pensacola. Well, not
Well,
quite.
Depending on low pressure cell, yeah.
Right. Okay. So we always want to pay attention to what's going on at Yucatan. And this is a typical spring migration map that might bring us some birds. This was a map from a number of years ago. You see the high pressure system off the Carolinas and another one up there in the north central states.
In this situation, those birds are going to wind up on the Louisiana, Texas coast because of the contours of the high pressure cell.
Okay.
This is an old map we used in one of our previous programs, I believe.
Okay. We've talked about a little bit about fallout, and we're not talking about nuclear fallout, mercifully. But fallout is an accumulation of migrants at a migrant trap. These birds were not present there anywhere from just a few hours before to the previous day. And a fallout is what we really hope for, either in spring or fall. The problem with fallout is that when it's good for the birders and we get a good fallout, that means the conditions have been tough for the birds. So it's, you wish for a fallout, but you know that it's going to be bad for the birds at any rate. So that's basically what fallout amounts to. I don't know if all of you aboard here this evening have seen a really classic fallout, but there have been times that we and other birders locally have been over on the beach at Fort Pickens and watched tanagers and swallows and other birds flying in off of the Gulf. They're tired, they're exhausted, and they put down right where they land, on the sea oats, on the blue stem, on whatever is there.
We were thinking that the classic fallouts were finished. We're not going to see that anymore in our lifetime. But 2 years ago, we were at Dauphin Island at the Alabama Ornithological Society meeting, and we had a classic fallout situation, and we had a classic fallout, and it was wonderful. So it can still happen.
It does still happen, just not nearly as frequently. Okay. So what causes a fallout? What's going to give us a fallout right here? Bob, you're the weatherman.
Okay, so we got a Bermuda high controlling all spring. We're not getting any birds. We used to think they were flying over Pensacola, but they were not. They were hundreds of miles to the west of us most of the time. So we're going to have something that breaks that pattern. What will it be? It'll be a low pressure cell moving across the continental United States and shifting those winds from the southeast to the south or southwest, and hopefully bring some rain, which will cause the birds to fall down. In this situation, we have a very narrow squall line. The birds left Yucatan on fair weather. They got to all the way across the Gulf until they got really close to the coast. Then they hit a very shallow squall line and they put down. And you can experience this at Fort Pickens sometime. In a situation like this, all of a sudden you have birds coming in, but they're not tired. They have not got clobbered in the Gulf. They have plenty of energy left. They're put down. They may be there for a few minutes. They probably move down the island. And next thing you know, they're gone. So what you want is something that's going to break that pattern. A pressure system moving from west to east across the continental United States is going to shift those winds around.
At Pickens, you can often see when this situation happens, this is not really this is a temporary fallout. The birds will put down very briefly, but at Pickens, they can look across the pass and, you know, you've just got a huge bank of wonderful oaks and habitat on the mainland. And they're going to take off and go there.
They're headed for the river swamps. The radar has shown that these birds, given a choice, they will be heading for the river swamps of the Escambia River, the Choctawhatchee, the Tombigbee.
We'll move on in. Now here's a different type of a fallout situation. Bob?
In this case, we have conditions for a classic fallout. This was a prediction, mind you. This was not an actual situation, but it was predicting what was going to transpire. As it turns out, you have rain well into the Gulf of Mexico. The birds who came up, left Yucatan on sunny skies and southeast winds, got about in the mid-Gulf, they started to hit south winds, and then behind that front, they met southwest and west winds, and would be transported to the northern Gulf Coast, our area of the Gulf Coast. And in this case, that particular day, the front was delayed. It was this whole picture would have been further west, and we got sunny skies and no birds. And Dauphin Island, just 60 miles west of here, got a tremendous fallout. So it all depends. It's something of a gamble. And now, one situation developed once. The birds, there was a big movement out of Yucatan, a big movement of birds. They got into mid-Gulf and then met a fast-moving cold front moving across the Gulf. It hit them in the mid-Gulf. The winds went around gale force out of the west. Where do you think those birds wound up? They wound up in the Tampa, St. Petersburg area. And my friends down there said they had the best fallout they've ever experienced. And the whole movement was moved due east, just to show you what influence wind direction and velocity has on bird movements.
Okay. So when the rain extends well out into the Gulf, you can expect a major fallout if it's geared for your area there. This is a painting by Charlie Harper, used with permission, and you can expect a major fallout if everything is just perfect. But if not, all it takes is one great bird to make a birding day perfect. And this was a painted redstart. And we and many other birders, probably 150 birders, were on Dauphin Island for the AOS meeting there in the spring. This was about 5 years ago. And there was not a migrant to be found. And this was during the second week of April, not a migrant to be found. And along comes a novice birder who looks up into the tree and says, "What is this pretty little bird with a red breast?" And it was a painted redstart, which is a bird that is found basically only in southeastern Arizona.
And she was from Pensacola, and we have never seen her again.
And it was just amazing. I don't even remember the gal's name right now, but she found one of the most phenomenal birds to have occurred here on the northern Gulf Coast. And that was a few years ago. I said, well, maybe 11 years ago. Anyway, it was the first record of that species for Alabama. And everybody who wanted to see it got to see it. It was fantastic. But anyway, I want to thank everybody who has given me photographs for this program. I thought I was thorough, and I may have used one of David Sparks' photographs. If so, I left his name off. At any rate, Jack Rogers, Jim Stevenson, Brenda Calloway, who did the photo on our book. And I did a few of the photographs myself. And we want to thank you for joining us in this quest to understand bird migration a little bit better here on the northern Gulf Coast. So are there more questions? if we can't answer it, we can find somebody who can, I think. Okay, here are two of the links. The first link is thewendy.com. And the second link is for Birdcast. And that's the Cornell University one. And that's the one that is a prediction. And you can actually scroll down on their website page and see the forecast for not just tonight, but tomorrow night and the next night and the next night. And of course, they modify those maps each day. But anyway, that's what we've got for you.
Thank you so much, Lucy and Bob. That was terrific.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you very much, very much.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Lucy.
Welcome.
You're most welcome. It's a joy to, when you love something, it's a joy to share it.
Steve, can we go to tile view?
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Lucy. Hope to see you again one of these days
I
in
hope so,
real
too.
life.
Okay.
Bye-bye.